What happened to the Butcher of Bosnia?
During the Bosnian War, Radovan Karadzic, 1945, the former president of the Serb Republic and commander of its armed forces, earned himself the ignominious nickname the Butcher of Bosnia for directing the massacres and mass victimization of enemies, many of them Muslims. Following the war, the United Nations International Court Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, in The Hague issued 2 indictments of Karadzic, charging him with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Karadzic disappeared in 1996 and was still at large in spring 2005. There were warrants for his arrest. In early December 1998, North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO forces arrested Karadzic henchman General Major Radislav Kristic, 1948. The high-ranking Serbian official was believed to have taken part in the July 1995 massacre of as many as 8,000 Muslims in the eastern Bosnian town of Srebrenica. On August 2, 2001, Kristic was found guilty of genocide, persecutions for murders, cruel and inhumane treatment, terrorizing the civilian population, forcible transfer and destruction of personal property of Bosnian Muslim civilians, and murder as a violation of the laws and customs of war. He was sentenced to 46 years in prison. After appeals, in April 2004, Kristic's sentence was reduced to 35 years based on the court's belief that he had aided and abetted acts of genocide but had not instigated them. He was transferred to Great Britain to serve out his sentence. Another high-ranking Serbian military leader who faced charges of genocide before the ICTY was General Ratko Mladic, 1942. As the former commander of the Bosnian Serb forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Mladic was considered responsible for the serious breaches of international humanitarian law committed by the Bosnian Serb forces between May 1992 and July 1995, including the massacre at Srebrenica. His indictment also included charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was still wanted in spring 2005.
What were the international contributions to the War on Terror?
According to the U.S. Central Command, by early 2005 there were 70 nations supporting the global war on terror, and 21 nations had deployed more than 16,000 troops to the U.S.-led operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Coalition forces contributed in a variety of ways, including providing intelligence, personnel, security assistance, equipment, and other assets for use in ground, air, and sea operations. Coalition members also provided humanitarian aid to civilians.
Why did NATO respond to the 9/11 attacks?
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, responded to the terrorist attacks on the United States. Because its charter states that an attack on any member nation is considered an attack on the alliance. The language is contained in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, signed April 4, 1949, in Washington, D.C., the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, will assist the party or parties so attacked. It was the first time Article 5 had been invoked by NATO since its founding. On September 12, 2001, NATO convened a special meeting in response to the attacks on American soil and afterward issued a statement saying, in part, that the United States could rely on the support and assistance of NATO if it was found that the attack was directed from abroad. The organization's Secretary General, Lord Robertson, 1946, strongly condemned the attacks and called for the international community and the members of the alliance to unite their forces in fighting the scourge of terrorism. The invocation of Article 5 was confirmed by NATO on October 2, after U.S. Ambassador-at-Large Frank Taylor briefed the organization's chief decision-making body on the investigations into the terrorist attacks. The North Atlantic Council determined that the information provided by Taylor confirmed that the individuals who carried out the attacks belonged to the worldwide terrorist network of Al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden and protected by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. At a press conference held October 8, Secretary General Lord Robertson announced NATO's full support for the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan. The following day it was confirmed that NATO assets had been deployed to the eastern Mediterranean to establish a presence in the region. But the alliance did not take a lead role in the military effort to oust the Taliban from Afghanistan.
What caused the Bosnian War?
To understand the war in Bosnia, 1992–95, it is important to review the history of Yugoslavia. Treaties at the end of World War I, 1914–18, dissolved the Austria-Hungarian Empire, creating separate nations of Austria and Hungary and dividing their former territory into three new countries: Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The various factions within the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes struggled for power. In 1929 King Alexander I, 1888–1934, an ethnic Serbian, dismissed the national parliament, did away with the constitution, 1921, and declared an absolute monarchy. He also changed the country's name to Yugoslavia. The government was then dominated by ethnic Serbs, who had settled in the region as early as the 7th century AD and were converted to Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, by the 9th century. but the Serbian authority was challenged by the nation's ethnic Croats, whose ancestors had settled in the region by the 7th century AD and were converted to Western Christianity, Roman Catholicism, by the Franks. To try to end the struggle, in 1939 Croats were given limited autonomy within Yugoslavia. The arrangement was short-lived. Yugoslavia was invaded by the Axis powers in April 1941 in World War II, 1939–45. The war over, in 1946 Yugoslavia was divided into 6 federated republics: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. But the lines of demarcation between these republics paid little regard to the ethnic boundaries of Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, who have been in the region since 1526, when it was invaded by Turks. Federal power was in the hands of communist leader Josip Broz Tito, 1892–1980. At first Tito tied his government to the Soviet Union. He directed the nationalization of land, industry, utilities, and natural resources. But after 1948 he pursued a policy of non-alignment. In the 1980s Yugoslavia's economy weakened, exacerbating regional differences. Tensions among ethnic groups flared. In 1991, as communism fell across Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia began to break apart. By March 1992 4 of its republics had declared independence: Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. What remained of Yugoslavia were Serbia and Montenegro. Serbs living in Bosnia and Herzegovina objected to the Declaration of Independence, which had been approved by the republic's Croats and Muslims. Fighting broke out in Bosnia, cantered around the capital city of Sarajevo. Troops from Serbia entered the region to back the ethnic uprising in Bosnia. As with many civil wars, the conflict divided families and friends. Evidence mounted that the Serbs, under the direction of leader Radovan Karadzic, 1945, were engaged in a program of ethnic cleansing, including the mass murder of tens of thousands of Muslim refugees. In May 1995, after the Serbian military in Bosnia refused to comply with the United Nations (UN) ultimatum, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, began a campaign of strategic airstrikes on Serbian targets. The NATO assaults weakened the Serbs and brought them to the negotiating table in November 1995, when U.S. mediators helped broker a peace agreement in Dayton, Ohio. A single state, Bosnia and Herzegovina, was re-established. It was to be governed through a power-sharing arrangement among Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. But the conflict in Yugoslavia was not over. By 1998 the region's ethnic disputes erupted into another civil war, this time in the Kosovo province. In 2003 Yugoslavia was effectively dissolved with the establishment of the country of Serbia, and Montenegro through a peace accord brokered by officials from the European Union, EU. The new arrangement gave greater autonomy to each republic.
When did the major combat phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom end?
President George W. Bush, 1946, declared an end to major combat on May 1, 2003. But the stabilization of Iraq was far from over. The fighting continued more than 2 years later, the result of an increasingly violent Iraqi insurgency. Faced with the ongoing resistance, in December 2004 the number of U.S. troops in the war-torn nation was increased from 130,000 to 150,000. Most of the casualties occurred after the declared end of major combat. On April 8, 2005, the Pentagon reported that there had been 1,543 American fatalities in the war to date, 1,174 in hostile actions and 369 in non-hostile actions, including accidents during routine maneuvers. Of the 1,543 U.S. military deaths, 1,404 died after the declared end of major combat, 1,065 of them from hostile action. More than 7,000 had been injured to date. In addition to the American fatalities, the British military had reported 86 deaths as of early April 2005, Italy 21, Ukraine 18, Poland 17, Spain 11, Bulgaria 8, Slovakia 3, Estonia, Thailand, and the Netherlands 2 each, and Denmark, El Salvador, Hungary, Kazakhstan, and Latvia 1 each. The figures fueled criticism for the lingering war, with some observers wondering if stabilization was possible in the fractious nation. There were several factors contributing to the growing lists of casualties and injuries. Coalition forces were frequently ambushed in attacks from resistance fighters and suicide bombers. U.S. troops faced continued combat in parts of Baghdad and its outskirts. The southern towns of Najaf and Kufa were holdouts of resistance, and there was intense fighting in the Sunni cities of Fallujah, Ramadi, and Samarra, which remained under insurgent control even after the transfer of political authority from the United States to the interim Iraqi Authority on June 28, 2004.
When did Operation Iraqi Freedom begin?
The U.S.-led multinational military campaign in Iraq began on March 19, 2003, with airstrikes on the capital of Baghdad. Ground forces moved into southern Iraq from neighboring Kuwait. After taking the southern city of Basra, U.S. Marines and Army infantry moved northward toward the capital. U.S. troops took control of Baghdad on April 9, after which images of gleeful Iraqis dismantling statues and other symbols of Saddam Hussein's despotic rule flooded the American media. Coalition forces, American troops, and U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters then pressed into northern Iraq, including Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, and a loyalist stronghold. On April 14 Tikrit fell. The war seemed to be near conclusion. but the hard combat had only begun and continued for years, even after the end of major combat was declared.
Let operation in Afghanistan begin?
Joined principally by the United Kingdom, the U.S.-led military strikes on Afghanistan began on October 7, 2001 to 26 days after the terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland. The goals were to weaken the Taliban government and root out terrorist cells in the Mideast nation. Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, 1957, the suspected 9/11 mastermind, was also a target. The strikes on Afghanistan, which the United States called Operation Enduring Freedom, OEF, were the first in the new war on terror. OEF's primary goal, ousting the ruling Taliban government, was achieved relatively quickly. By mid-November, the combined efforts of the U.S. military, British, and Afghanistan's Northern Alliance managed to take control of major cities, including the capital of Kabul. In late December, an interim government was established at an unconvened conference in Bonn, Germany. In June 2002, Hamid Karzai, 1957, was overwhelmingly elected as transitional president by the Loya Jirga, the traditional Afghan assembly of ethnic leaders. The transitional government was to run Afghanistan until national elections could be held in 2004. Despite strides in establishing the new government, fighting continued in the rugged mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan. Operation Anaconda was the name given to the U.S. military's effort to combat Taliban pockets of resistance, root out terrorist cells, and capture key al-Qaeda leaders, including Osama bin Laden, though he had reportedly fled to neighboring Pakistan. Violence also preceded the October 2004 election.
How could so many people, Hutus, have participated in the mass cleansing?
Experts point to Rwanda's deeply divided history. The rivalry between Hutus and Tutsis dates back hundreds of years, since the Tutsis first arrived in the Central African region in the 14th century.
What caused the fighting in Kosovo?
The conflict in Kosovo, like that in Bosnia, was ethnic-based. Kosovo is a province at the southern end of Serbia. It neighbors Albania and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Many Albanians still live in Kosovo and see themselves more closely aligned with Albania to the southwest than with Yugoslavia. Thus, a separatist movement began, which caused mounting tension between ethnic Albanians and Serbian authorities. Early in 1998, Serbian forces and Yugoslav army units moved to suppress the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, the guerrilla force that sought independence for the province's Albanian population. In October, Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, 1941, agreed to end the crackdown, but this was only after the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, had repeatedly threatened airstrikes. However, in the months that followed Milosevic's stated compliance, there was more violence against ethnic Albanians. By January 1999, hundreds had been killed and more than 250,000 people were displaced from their homes, many of them seeking shelter in makeshift huts in the forest. Victims included the elderly, women, and children. On March 23, 1999, Yugoslav Serb parliament rejected NATO demands for autonomy in Kosovo, as well as the plan to send NATO peacekeeping troops into the troubled province. The following day, NATO launched a campaign of airstrikes against Yugoslavia, with the intent to weaken Milosevic and force him to comply with international demands to settle the conflict. After more than 50 days of airstrikes, which included some controversial and deadly errors on NATO's part, it appeared that while NATO was winning the air campaign against Yugoslavia, the Serbian government of Yugoslavia was winning a ground campaign against the Kosovar Albanians. Of the estimated 1.8 million ethnic Albanians in Yugoslavia, Milosevic's forces had driven out or killed all but 130,000. Meantime, evidence of Serb atrocities toward ethnic Albanians mounted, as mass graves were discovered and survivors who fled Kosovo reported horrific tales of torture and rape at the hands of the Serbs. Ultimately, NATO's Operation Allied Force was successful. On June 10, 1999, after a 77-day air campaign, the bombing was temporarily suspended because Yugoslav forces had begun to fully withdraw from Kosovo. The withdrawal was in compliance with an agreement drawn up between NATO and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and Republic of Serbia on the evening of June 9. By June 20, the Serb withdrawal was complete and a multinational security force was established to keep the peace. That same day, NATO announced that it had formally terminated the air campaign. NATO personnel were reassigned as peacekeepers and to move humanitarian aid, including food, water, tents, and medical supplies. Though the crisis in Kosovo was over, the aftermath was immense. It was estimated that by the end of May 1999, 1.5 million people, or 90% of the Kosovar population, had been expelled from their homes and 250,000 Kosovar men were missing. Further, there was mounting evidence that ethnic Albanians had been the victims of genocide. This evidence included the discoveries of mass graves, reports of mass executions, expulsions and rape, and the systematic destruction of property and crops. In 2003, in a peace accord brokered by the European Union, the nation of Serbia and Montenegro was established, with each republic receiving greater autonomy. The nation of Yugoslavia no longer existed.
Why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor?
there is still disagreement among historians, military scholars, and investigators about why the island nation of Japan issued the surprise attack on the U.S. military installation at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Some believe that Japan had been baited into making the attack in order to marshal public opinion behind U.S. entry into World War II, 1939-45. Others maintain that the United States was unprepared for such an assault, or at least, the Japanese believed Americans to be in a state of unreadiness. And still others theorize that Pearl Harbor was an all-or-nothing gamble on the part of Japan to knock America's navy out of the war before it had even entered into the fray. These are the facts. In 1941, Japanese troops had moved into the southern part of Indochina, prompting the United States to cut off its exports to Japan. In fall of that year, as General Hideki Tojo, 1884-1948, became Prime Minister of Japan, the country's military leaders were laying plans to wage war on the United States. On December 7, Pearl Harbor, the hub of U.S. naval power in the Pacific, became the target of Japanese attacks, as did the American military bases at Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. But it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor that became the rallying cry for Americans during the long days of World War II, since it was at this strategic naval station, which had been occupied under treaty by the U.S. military since 1908, that Americans had felt the impact of the conflict.
What happened at Anzio?
Anzio, Italy, was the site of a 4-month battle between Allied troops and the Germans during World War II, 1939-45. On January 22, 1944, more than 36,000 Allied troops and thousands of vehicles made an amphibious landing at Anzio, which is situated on a peninsula jutting into the Tyrrhenian Sea. But German soldiers, led by Field Marshal Albert Kesserling, 1885-1960, were able to surround the Allied forces, containing them along the shoreline into May of that year. Fighting was intense, with an estimated 60,000 casualties, about half on each side. On May 25, 1944, the Germans withdrew in defeat, enabling the Allies to march toward Rome, 33 miles to the north-northwest. The taking of Anzio was a tactical surprise on the part of the US and British, and their eventual victory there was a turning point for the Allies in the war.
What happened to Slobodan Milosevic?
Like other Serb leaders involved in the recent Baltic Wars, former Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, 1941, faced charges of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity at the International Court Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, ICTY, in The Hague. He was arrested in Belgrade on April 1, 2001, and transferred to The Hague in June. There he faced 66 counts of war crimes from the Balkan conflicts. Before the ICTY, he pled innocent of 3 indictments against him. One for each major war crimes scene, Kosovo, Croatia, and Bosnia. His trial began on February 12, 2002, and was marked by numerous idiosyncrasies, including Milosevic's attempts to represent himself, without the benefit of counsel. His frequent refusals to cooperate with the court, and numerous days lost to his various illnesses. The prosecution wrapped up its case against him on February 25, 2004. After hearing testimony from almost 300 witnesses. The defense portion of the trial began on August 31, 2004, and was slated to last 150 court days. Not the same as calendar days. As of June 2005, the trial was still underway in The Hague.
Why did the U.S. government order the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II?
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, American citizens of Japanese descent were viewed as threats to the nation's security. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt, 1882-1945, signed an executive order directing that they be moved to camps for containment for the duration of the war. More than 100,000 people, most of them from California and other West Coast states, were rounded up and ordered to live in secure camps. The action drew immediate criticism, with thousands of lives interrupted without cause. The chapter is one of the saddest in American history. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which made reparations to the victims of the Japanese internment. $20,000 was paid to internees, evacuees, and persons of Japanese ancestry who lost liberty or property because of discriminatory action by the federal government during World War II. It also established a $1.25 billion public education fund to teach children and the public about the internment period.
What was the Battle of the Bulge?
The term refers to the December 16, 1944, German confrontation with the American forces in the Ardennes Mountains, a forested plateau range that extends from northern France into Belgium and Luxembourg. Even though Germany appeared to be beaten at this late point in the war, Hitler rallied his remaining forces and launched a surprise assault on the American soldiers in Belgium and Luxembourg. But Germany could not sustain the front, and within 2 weeks the Americans had halted the German advance near Belgium's Meuse River, south of Brussels. The offensive became known as the Battle of the Bulge, because of the protruding shape of the battleground on a map. The Ardennes were also the site of conflict earlier in World War II. In 1940, as well as in World War I, in 1914 and 1918.
What happened at Normandy?
Normandy, a region in northwestern France that lies along the English Channel, is known for the June 6, 1944, arrival of Allied troops, which proved to be a turning point in World War II, 1939–45. Officially called Operation Overlord, but known historically as D-Day, and headed by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1890–1969, of the United States. The initiative had been in the planning since 1943 and it constituted the largest seaborne invasion in history. After several delays due to poor weather, the Allied troops crossed the English Channel and arrived on the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6. Brutal fighting ensued that day, with heavy losses on both sides. At the end of the day, the Allied troops had taken hold of the beaches, a firm foothold that would allow them to march inland against the Nazis, eventually pushing them back to Germany. While it was a critical Allied victory, which history has treated as the beginning of the end for German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, the invasion at Normandy was still to be followed by 11 more months of bloody conflict. Germany would not surrender until May 7 of the following year.
What did President George H. W. Bush mean when he said the U.S. had to draw a line in the sand?
President George H. W. Bush, 1924, was reacting to Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's 1937 act of aggression when on August 2, 1990, his troops invaded neighboring Kuwait. The United Nations, UN, gave Iraq until January 15, 1991, to withdraw from Kuwait. Iraq failed to comply. The line in the sand that Hussein crossed was soon defended. On January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm was launched to liberate the Arab nation of Kuwait from Iraq, whose military dictator had not only invaded Kuwait but proclaimed it a new Iraqi province. Bush averred, "This will not stand," and in order to protect U.S. oil supplies in the country, the president mobilized U.S. forces, which were joined by a coalition of 39 nations, to soundly and quickly defeat Iraq.
Why was the Persian Gulf War important?
The 6-week war, telecast around the world from start to finish, February–April 1991, was significant because it was the first major international crisis to take place in the post-Cold War era. The United Nations proved to be effective in organizing the coalition against aggressor Iraq. Leading members of the coalition included Egypt, France, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the United States. The conflict also tested the ability of the United States and the Soviet Union, then still in existence as such, to cooperate in world affairs.
What is D-Day?
The military uses the term D-Day to designate when an initiative is set to begin, counting all events out from that date for planning. For example, D-Day-2 would be a plan for what needs to happen 2 days before the beginning of the military operation. While the military planned and executed many D-Days during World War II, 1939–45, most of them landings on enemy-held coasts. It was the June 6, 1944, invasion of Normandy that went down in history as the D-Day.
What happened in the Rwandan genocide?
On April 6, 1994, the airplane carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana. 1937–1994, of Rwanda's majority Hutu ethnic group, was shot down by unknown attackers. The event touched off, or was used as an excuse for, what one journalist described as a premeditated orgy of killing in which ethnic Hutu extremists carried out a campaign of mass murder against minority Tutsis. 10 years after the horrific events, the Chicago Tribune's Africa correspondent recounted how Rwanda's Hutu majority, equipped with machetes and called to action by government radio announcements, slaughtered neighbors, friends, co-workers. Priests killed parishioners who sought refuge in churches. Teachers murdered pupils. Hundreds of thousands of women were raped. Children burned or drowned, bodies pushed into mass graves. The massacre continued for 3 months, ending only when Tutsi fighters managed to seize the capital at Kigali and take power. In 2004, the Rwandan government released its official estimate of the death toll. 937,000 people were murdered, making it the worst ethnic cleansing the world has seen since the Holocaust during World War II, 1939–45. But, unlike the Holocaust, which was carried out by a dictatorial military machine, the Rwandan genocide was carried out by the masses. In the aftermath, more than 150,000 people were accused of participating in the massive violence. Though the Rwandan courts had only tried a small fraction of those, no more than 10% in 10 years. An estimated 2 million Hutus, many who probably feared retribution, had fled to neighboring countries after the Tutsis gained power. The genocide had happened at the hands of many. In the decade since the Rwandan genocide, Rwandans and the world have grappled with difficult and perhaps unanswerable questions.
What was the Taliban?
It was the ultra-conservative faction that ruled Afghanistan from late 1996 until December 2001. When its government crumbled following a U.S.-led military campaign. The Persian word Taliban means students. The group was made up of Afghan refugees who, during the Soviet invasion, 1979–89, had fled their country for Pakistan, where they attended conservative Islamic religious schools. After the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and amidst the unrest that ensued, the Taliban rose to prominence. They gained control of the nation region by region, eventually taking the capital of Kabul in 1996. While in power, the group put into force strict laws based on a fundamental interpretation of Islam. The Taliban excluded women from Afghan society, and it allowed the nation to become a training ground for Islamic terror groups such as Al-Qaeda. Very few nations of the world recognized the Taliban government. Its human rights abuses, principally the complete disenfranchisement of women and girls, were decried by the international community. But the breaking point came after the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland. When the American government requested that the suspected mastermind of those attacks be extradited from Afghanistan to the United States, the Taliban refused. The group was forcibly ousted in the brief military campaign that followed. In December 2001, the United Nations, UN, convened a conference in Bonn, Germany, where leaders of anti-Taliban ethnic factions decided on a post-Taliban transitional government, led by Pashtun leader Hamid Karzai. The Pashtuns are the dominant group in Afghanistan, representing about 42% of the population. The next largest group is the Tajik, which represents about 27% of the population in the highly fragmented nation of 28.5 million people. Attendees also agreed to an unled peacekeeping operation. Though ethnic rivalries and sporadic conflicts continued under the transitional government, Afghanistan made strides in building a stable, democratic government. One encouraging sign of reform came in March 2005, with the appointment of Habiba Sorabi, the first woman to become a provincial governor in Afghanistan history. Sorabi was chosen by the president for her post, which she assumed in late March. When did the U.S.
What happened at Pearl Harbor?
On the night before the attack, the Japanese moved a fleet of 33 ships to within 200 miles of the Hawaiian island of Oahu, where Pearl Harbor is situated. More than 300 planes took off from the Japanese carriers, dropping the first bombs on Pearl Harbor just before 8 a.m. on December 7. 1941. There were 8 American battleships and more than 90 naval vessels in the harbor at the time. 21 of these were destroyed or damaged, as were 300 planes. The biggest single loss of the day was the sinking of the battleship USS Arizona, which went down in less than 9 minutes. More than half the fatalities at Pearl Harbor that infamous December day were due to the sinking of the Arizona. By the end of the raid, more than 2,300 people had been killed and about the same number were wounded. Pearl Harbor forever changed the United States and its role in the world. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt 1882 to 1945 addressed Congress the next day, he called December 7 a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war against Japan. And on December 11 Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis allies, declared war on the United States. The events of December 7 had brought America into the war. A conflict from which it would emerge as the leader of the free world. When did the first U.S.
Why did General MacArthur vow to return?
Two weeks after the Japanese bombing of the U.S. military bases at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, Japan invaded the Philippine Islands. General Douglas MacArthur, 1880 to 1964. The commander of the U.S. Army forces in the Far East, led the defense of the archipelago. He had begun to organize his troops around Manila Bay when, in March 1942, he received orders from the president to leave the islands. When he reached Australia, MacArthur said, "I shall return," in reference to the Philippines. Under new commands, MacArthur directed the Allied forces offensive against Japan throughout the Southwest Pacific Islands. After a string of successes, on October 20, 1944, MacArthur made good on his promise. Landing on the Philippine island of Leyte, accompanied by a great invasion force. By July of the following year, the general had established practical control of the Philippines. When Japan surrendered in August, MacArthur was made the supreme commander of the Allies, and as such, he presided over the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri on September 2. He received the Medal of Honor for his defense of the Philippines. But he wasn't the only hero in the MacArthur family. His father, Arthur MacArthur, 1845 to 1912, had received the nation's highest military award during the Civil War, 1861 to 65.
Mainland attacked during World War II?
Yes, the continental United States was hit twice during the war. But with no casualties and only minimal damage. The first attack occurred at approximately 7 p.m. on February 23, 1942, when a Japanese submarine shelled an oil storage field at Elwood Beach, California, about 12 miles north of Santa Barbara. The Japanese were trying to hit oil tanks there, evidently with the intent of producing a spectacular explosion. But after firing a reported 16 or 17 rounds, they had struck only a pier. Most of the shells fell into the sea, well short of their targets. U.S. planes gave chase, but the submarine got away. There were no injuries and only minimal damage. But the event put the nation on heightened alert to the possibility of more attacks. The February 23 attack took place shortly after President Franklin Roosevelt. 1882 to 1945, had begun his fireside chat, addressing the nation over the radio. He talked about how this war was different, since it was being waged on every continent. Every island, every sea, every air lane in the world. He also said, the broad oceans which have been heralded in the past as our protection from attack have become endless battlefields on which we are constantly being challenged by our enemies. The unsuccessful assault at Elwood was the first attack on mainland U.S. soil since the War of 1812-14. The event stirred fears of conspiracy and rattled nerves up and down the West Coast. There was one other strike on mainland soil during World War II, at Fort Stevens, Oregon, at the mouth of the Columbia River. On the evening of June 21, 1942, a Japanese submarine fired some 17 rounds of shells at the coastal military installation but caused no damage.
What is the conflict over Chechnya?
Since the 1990s, separatist factions have been fighting for the independence of the tiny Russian Republic. At just more than 6,000 square miles in area, it is about the size of Hawaii. Chechnya's population falls into three main ethnic groups: Chechens, the majority, Ingush, and Russian. The religion of the Chechen and the Ingush peoples is Islam, while the Russian population is mostly Orthodox Christian. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, the region remained with the new Russian Federation as the Chechen Ingush Republic. But dissent grew, and in 1991 a rebel faction led by Jakar Dudayev, 1944 to 1996, took control of the government. Chechnya separated from Ingushetia to form two separate republics in 1992. In 1994, Russian troops invaded to reclaim the Chechen capital of Grozny, an oil and manufacturing center. By this time, two factions existed among the rebels. One was a nationalist movement and the other a fundamentalist Islamic movement. In 1995 the conflict spilled over into neighboring regions, as Chechen militants began a series of terror attacks. In June of that year, gunmen seized a hospital in Budyanovsk, about 90 miles north of the Chechen border, in the Stavropol territory, and held 1,800 people hostage for 6 days. More than 100 people were killed and hundreds were injured. In 1996, Chechen terrorists seized another hospital, holding 2,000 hostages. This time in neighboring Dagestan, at least 23 people were killed. Russia's military strikes in Chechnya continued until a ceasefire was negotiated in 1996, by which time dissident leader Dudayev had been killed. even after a peace treaty was signed in 1997, ending the First Chechen War. The status of Russia's breakaway republic remained unclear. In 1999 the battle over Chechnya's status was taken straight to the Russian capital of Moscow, where 5 bombings in 4 weeks claimed 300 lives. Islamic militants in Chechnya were blamed. The Kremlin responded with force, leveling Grozny by early 2000 and displacing 250,000 people from their homes. A pro-Moscow administration was put into place. Violence related to the Chechen conflict continued throughout Russia. Suicide bombings alone claimed more than 260 lives between 2002 and 2004. There were large-scale assaults as well. In October 2002 Chechen militants took more than 700 people hostage at a Moscow theater. After a 2-day standoff, Russian special forces stormed the building, killing 41 Chechen fighters and 129 hostages. In August 2004 2 airliners crashed within minutes of each other after taking off from the same airport. 90 people died in the crashes, which Russian President Vladimir Putin, 1952, labeled terrorism. And on September 1, 2004, 32 armed militants seized an elementary school in Beslan, North Ossetia, a region bordering Chechnya. The terrorists held some 1,200 hostages for 48 hours. At which time Russian forces stormed the building. 335 people died, most of them children. Leaders of the Chechen nationalist movement distanced themselves from the terrorist acts, the responsibility for which were claimed by a militant Chechen Muslim group. Chechnya continued to be unstable, with Putin resolved to a hardline approach to the breakaway republic. In elections held in March 2003, voters reportedly approved a new constitution that declared Chechnya to be part of Russia. But critics found the election results irregular, with almost 96% of voters expressing support for the referendum. Months later, pro-Moscow leadership was elected in the person of Deputy Prime Minister Ramzan Kadyrov. Critics called it a puppet regime. In March 2005 Chechen nationalist leader Aslan Moskadov, 1951–2005, was killed in a Russian assault. His death was seen as a victory for Moscow. Moskadov, who had briefly been president 1997–1999, of an independent Chechnya, was generally viewed as a moderate who believed an honest dialogue between the two sides could bring an end to the decade-long conflict.
When was Saddam Hussein captured?
The former Iraqi leader, known for his cruelty, was caught on December 14, 2003, 8 months after the fall of Baghdad. Hussein, 1937, was found in Ad-Dor, about 9 miles from his hometown of Tikrit. He was said to be hiding like a rat, in a hole across the Tigris River from one of his palaces. His 6 to 8 foot bunker was equipped with a basic ventilation system and was camouflaged with bricks and dirt. A disheveled Hussein had in his possession about $750,000 as well as arms, which he did not use. The former dictator was taken into custody in what U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld called a surprisingly peaceful manner. Despite that, Hussein reportedly remained defiant and unrepentant when he was asked about the thousands of people killed and dumped into mass graves during his regime. He dismissed his victims as thieves. The news of his capture prompted jubilation in Baghdad and across the nation. Crowds of Iraqis flooded into the streets to celebrate the end of his brutal rule. But his hometown of Tikrit, considered a loyalist stronghold, remained quiet. The news of his capture was welcomed by leaders around the globe. In a short televised address from the White House, President Bush remarked that Hussein would face the justice he denied to millions. Bush also reassured the Iraqi people that they would not have to fear the rule of Saddam Hussein ever again. Hussein was held for questioning in Iraq. Upon the June 28, 2004, transfer of authority, Iraq was given legal custody of the former ruler, who became a criminal defendant instead of a prisoner of war.
What is Al-Qaeda?
Al-Qaeda, Arabic, meaning the base, is a global network of terrorists who banded together during the 1990s and proclaimed to be carrying out a holy war on non-Islamic nations. The group knows no national boundaries, though certain nations, including Afghanistan, were known to be Al-Qaeda strongholds. Led by the elusive Osama bin Laden, 1957, a wealthy exiled Saudi, the group conducted terrorist training programs in several Muslim, mostly Middle Eastern, countries and was funded by loyalists around the world. One of the United States' first actions following the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, which were later confirmed to have been carried out by Al-Qaeda operatives, was to freeze bank accounts of persons and organizations with suspected ties to the terrorist group. The roots of Al-Qaeda can be traced to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, when thousands of Muslims, including bin Laden, joined the Afghan resistance. The 10-year conflict was a rallying point for Islamic extremists. Bin Laden returned home to Saudi Arabia in 1989, determined to perpetuate a holy war, jihad, by maintaining the funding, organization, and training that had made the Afghan resistance victorious against the Soviets. By the early 1990s he emerged as a leader in the Muslim world, proclaiming his goal to reinstate the Caliphate, a unified Muslim state. He also proclaimed the United States to be an enemy to Islam. He considered the nation responsible for all conflicts involving Muslims. The Saudi government rescinded his passport in 1994, and bin Laden fled his homeland. he eventually found safe harbor in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. According to the report issued by the 9/11 Commission, bin Laden's declaration of war came in February 1998. When he and fugitive Egyptian physician Ayman al-Zawahiri arranged from their Afghanistan headquarters for an Arabic newspaper in London to publish what they termed a fatwa issued in the name of a World Islamic Front. The statement claimed that America had declared war against God and his messenger, and they called for retaliation. Under bin Laden's direction, Al-Qaeda carried out several attacks on American targets, including the August 7, 1998, bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed 258 and injured 5,000, and the September 11, 2001, attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, which killed nearly 3,000 people. After the global coalition against terrorism, led by U.S. forces, launched its attack on Afghanistan in October 2001, bin Laden was believed to have fled for Pakistan. Capturing him and other Al-Qaeda leaders and operatives was the key objective of the United States in its efforts to dismantle the terrorist network.
What was the Atlantic Charter?
On the eve of direct U.S. involvement in World War II, 1939–45, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882–1945, met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. 1874–1965, on board a ship off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. There the two leaders drew up a program of peace objectives known as the Atlantic Charter, which they signed on August 14, 1941. In addition to other peacetime goals, the charter roughly contained Roosevelt's four freedoms, which he had outlined in his speech to Congress on January 6, 1941. As the legislative body considered passage of the Lend-Lease Act, Roosevelt believed that freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear should prevail around the world. Briefly, in the Atlantic Charter the two leaders stated that neither of their countries sought new territories, that they respected the right of the people of each country to choose their own form of government, that no country, great or small, victor or vanquished, would be deprived access to the raw materials it needed for its own economic prosperity, that countries should cooperate to improve labor standards and social security, that after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want, and that a wider and permanent system of general security would be necessary to ensure peace. This last statement alludes to the future establishment of the United Nations.
What happened in the anthrax scare of 2001?
The anthrax scare unfolded shortly after the September 11, 2001. Terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. When news first broke that anthrax-laced letters were received at East Coast media outlets and U.S. congressional offices, there were fears that the spreading of the infectious bacterium was linked to the 9/11 attacks. But the investigation later pointed toward a domestic perpetrator, still unknown in mid-2005. According to a report from the Office of Homeland Security, the anthrax events began on October 2, 2001, when an infectious disease doctor in Palm Beach County, Florida, reported a suspected case of inhalation anthrax. That diagnosis was confirmed by the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. On October 4 and the information was released to the public, rattling the nerves of an already jittery nation. On October 5 the first victim of the anthrax attacks, the 63-year-old South Florida man who had been hospitalized, died. On October 7 investigators announced that evidence of the anthrax bacterium was found in his workplace. The Florida offices of American Media Inc., AMI, publisher of the National Enquirer, Sun, and other tabloids. On October 12 New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani announced that an NBC News employee in the office of anchorman Tom Brokaw had tested positive for cutaneous, skin, anthrax, a less dangerous form of the bacterium. 3 days later, it was reported that a letter containing suspicious powder was opened in the office of Senator Tom Dashley, South Dakota, in the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. The next day the powder tested positive for anthrax. October 16 brought the news that the infant son of an ABC News producer in New York City had tested positive for exposure to the skin form of anthrax. The baby had visited the ABC News offices weeks earlier, and officials believed exposure had occurred at that time. The same day, it was announced that a second AMI worker, a 73-year-old mailroom employee, was diagnosed with inhalation anthrax and was in intensive care. The announcements brought the number of confirmed anthrax cases to 4, 2 inhalation and 2 cutaneous. Within days CDC officials had linked all 4 cases to the intentional delivery of B. anthracis spores through mailed letters or packages. The FBI urged the public to handle any suspicious packages with care, to not open, smell, or taste them, and to call 911 immediately. On October 18 a worker at CBS News in New York was reported to have been infected with skin anthrax. The next day the public learned that an editorial assistant in the Manhattan offices of the New York Post had also been diagnosed with the skin form of the disease. Also on October 18 and 19 the CDC confirmed diagnoses of both inhalation and cutaneous anthrax in New Jersey postal workers, who had begun showing symptoms of infection on October 13. Between October 19 and 22 4 workers from a Washington, D.C. postal facility were confirmed to have been infected with inhalation anthrax and were hospitalized. On October 22 2 of them died. 2 days later the U.S. Postmaster General announced to the public There are no guarantees that the mail is safe, and he advised hand-washing after handling the mail. On October 31, a New York hospital worker died of inhalation anthrax, becoming the fourth fatality. But investigators could not determine how the woman had been exposed to the bacterium. By mid-November, traces of anthrax had been discovered in mail facilities that supplied the CIA. The Senate and House office buildings, the Supreme Court, Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, the White House. Washington, D.C.'s Brentwood Mail Processing and Distribution Center, Washington, D.C.'s Southwest Postal Station. A Kansas City postal facility, the Pentagon's post office, and 4 more New Jersey postal facilities. Antibiotics were distributed to thousands of workers as a preventive measure. On November 16, an anthrax-laced letter addressed to Senator Patrick Leahy, Vermont, was discovered in a batch of quarantined Capitol Hill mail. The handwriting, all uppercase, was similar to that in the letter addressed to Senator Dashley. And the 2 letters carried identical messages: September 11, 01/You cannot stop us/ we have the anthrax. /you die now. /are you afraid / death to America. /death to Israel. /Allah is great. The letters sent to the senators were postmarked October 9, 2001, in Trenton, New Jersey. The message and handwriting in those letters were also similar to those in letters addressed to the editor of the New York Post and to Tom Brokaw at NBC News, both of which read: September 11, 01/ this is next / take penicillin sick now / death to America / death to Israel / Allah is great. The letters sent to the media outlets were postmarked September 18, 2001, also in Trenton, New Jersey. The Franklin Park, New Jersey return address was identical on all 4 letters. But it was a non-existent location. Investigators believed that whoever sent out the deadly missives was familiar with the area. On November 20 it was confirmed that an elderly Connecticut woman, who had died the day before, had been infected with anthrax. The 94-year-old was believed to have been exposed to a letter that had been cross-contaminated in the mail. All 5 anthrax deaths were caused by the inhalation form of the bacterium. In total, 22 cases of anthrax were identified between October 4 and November 20, 11 of them were the deadly inhalation form. 6 people survived, and 11 were the less serious skin form. In all but 2 cases, the New York hospital worker and the elderly Connecticut woman. The victims were mail handlers or were exposed to work sites that had been contaminated by mail. Investigators concluded that all of the anthrax spores were of the same strain, called Ames, but that the letters contained different grades of the bacterium. By November 9, 2001, the FBI had issued a behavioral/linguistic assessment of the offender based on the known anthrax parcels. The offender is believed to be an adult male who has access to a source of anthrax and possesses the knowledge and expertise to refine it. The FBI headed a multi-agency effort to identify the perpetrator of the deadly attacks.
What was the Bataan Death March?
It was one of the most brutal chapters of World War II, 1939–45. On April 9, 1942, American forces on the Bataan Peninsula, Philippines, surrendered to the Japanese. More than 75,000 American and Filipino troops became prisoners of war, POWs. On April 10, they were forced to begin a 65-mile march to a POW camp. Conditions were torturous: high temperatures, meager provisions, and gross maltreatment. The troops were denied food and water for days at a time. They were not allowed to rest in the shade. They were indiscriminately beaten, and those who fell behind were killed. On stretches where some troops were transported by train, the boxcars were packed so tightly that many POWs died of suffocation. The forced march lasted more than a week. 20,000 men died along the way. But the end of the march was not the end of the horrors for the surviving POWs. About 56,000 men were held until the end of the war. They endured starvation, torture, and horrific cruelties. Some were forced to work as slave laborers in Japanese industrial plants, and some became subjects of medical experiments. In August 1945 their POW camp was liberated by the Allied forces, and the surviving troops were put on U.S. Navy vessels for the trip home, as part of the United States' 1951 peace treaty with Japan. Surviving POWs were barred from seeking reparations from Japanese firms that had benefited from their slave labor. This injustice continued to be the subject of proposed congressional legislation into the early 2000s. With no positive outcome for the veterans as of 2005.
What is the War on Terror?
In his remarks the evening of September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush, 1946, vowed that America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world. And we stand together to win the war against terrorism. TV newscasts were soon emblazoned with the message. America's War on Terror, or simply, the War on Terror. The events of 9/11 catapulted the free world into a new era, in which conflicts no longer were limited to wars between nations. There was a new enemy, which knew no national boundaries, whose army was covert, and which mercilessly targeted civilians. Acknowledging that the new threat could not be met by the United States alone, the Bush administration began forging an alliance of nations that together would use diplomacy, take military action, and coordinate intelligence and law enforcement efforts to combat terrorists around the globe. On September 12, 2001, Secretary of State Colin Powell, 1937, called for a global coalition against terrorism. Eventually the Bush administration put together an alliance of 84 countries, called the Global Coalition Against Terrorism, united against a common danger, and joined in a common purpose. The strike on Afghanistan, called Operation Enduring Freedom, was the first military strategy in the new war. The next major initiative was the war in Iraq. While those operations were underway, terrorist strikes continued around the globe. In March 2004, following the commuter train blasts in Spain, President Bush remarked that the murders in Madrid are a reminder that the civilized world is at war. And in this new kind of war, civilians find themselves suddenly on the front lines. In recent years, terrorists have struck from Spain, to Russia, to Israel, to East Africa, to Morocco, to the Philippines, and to the United States. They've targeted Arab states such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Yemen. They've attacked Muslims in Indonesia, Turkey, Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. No nation or region is exempt from the terrorists' campaign of violence.
Were the anthrax attacks acts of terrorism?
Yes, as U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft said. When people send anthrax through the mail to hurt people and invoke terror, it's a terrorist act. Investigators believe the attacks, which killed 5 people and sickened 17 others, were acts of domestic terrorism. But whoever was responsible for mailing anthrax spores in the fall of 2001 remained unknown in mid-2005. Some observers believed the attacks were carried out to expose the nation's vulnerability to bioterrorist attacks.
How could the world body have allowed such an event to happen? Particularly with the Nazi Holocaust a not too distant memory?
Again, there is no easy answer. The United Nations withdrew its people when the violence began in April 1994, but some UN officials estimated later that perhaps as few as 5,000 troops might have been able to prevent the annihilation. The United States did not intervene in the Rwandan genocide. The recent images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, Somalia, in October 1993, had left the country reticent to involve itself in the world's hotspots. But, even with the lesson of Rwanda, experts wondered how the international response might differ today.
What are WMD?
WMD are weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons that can cause extensive casualties. The term emerged during World War II, 1939-45, the abbreviated WMD became part of everyday language in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the world's superpowers and the United Nations turned their attention to serious threats posed by rogue states and terrorists in a post-Cold War society. Following the launch of the 2003 Iraq War, WMD were regularly in the news. The Bush administration and its chief ally, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, faced sharp public criticism when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. The presence of WMD in that rogue state had been the justification for the controversial invasion. In 2004, President Bush appointed a bipartisan commission to look into why U.S. intelligence agencies had concluded that Iraq possessed WMD. In late March 2005, the commission released to the public an unclassified version of its report. The conclusion: intelligence errors had overstated Iraq's WMD programs. It stated, "The daily intelligence briefings, before the Iraq War, were flawed. This was a major intelligence error." The Commission outlined 74 recommendations to improve intelligence gathering among the United States' 15 spy agencies. The classified version of the report contained information on the intelligence community's assessments of the nuclear programs of many of the world's most dangerous actors. It also provided more details on intelligence concerning the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. In Britain, the intelligence failures concerning Iraq spurred a years-long controversy, which damaged Blair's approval ratings and posed tragic consequences. In addition to the loss of life in Iraq, British weapons inspector David Kelly took his own life after publicly accusing the government of overstating the need for war. As in the United States, Britain took steps to tighten controls on its intelligence gathering to prevent errors in judgment. Despite the fact that no WMD were found in Iraq, the White House stood firm on the decision to invade Iraq. On September 11, 2004, the Office of the Press Secretary released a fact sheet titled 3 Years of Progress in the War on Terror. The document stated in part, "We were right to go into Iraq. We removed a declared enemy of America, who had defied the international community for 12 years. And who had the capability of producing weapons of mass murder. And could have passed that capability to the terrorists bent on acquiring them. Although we have not found stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. In the world after September 11, that was a risk we could not afford to take.